So our final session today is on homosexuality and the limits of inclusion. And I want to introduce our two presenters and then we'll get right into it. Ronnie Jo Draper is a professor of education in the David O. McKay School of Education at Brigham Young University. She teaches courses in multicultural education, content area literacy, and research methodology. She's an advocate for awareness on issues relating to homosexuality and is part of the Mama Dragons network, and I'll let her tell you more about that, that facilitates support groups and other activities to create understanding and inclusiveness in religious communities. And then Christian Harrison. I lost you, Christian. There are two Harrisons. Christian Harrison is part of the leadership team for Affirmation International and is brand manager at Utah Foster Care Foundation. Christian came to Utah Foster Care with a professional background in brand and strategic communications. His previous experience in internet startup world as a creative director for several firms continues to serve him as he works at the foundation and he manages Utah Foster Care Foundation's evolving brand. He identifies as an entrepreneur, an urban enthusiast, gay, and Mormon. So this will be kind of a fun session, I think, and I'll turn it over to Ronnie Jo. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to read my comments, which is really weird for me, but I don't even know why I have to tell you that. I just feel the need. My name is Roni Jo Draper. I am the mother of a queer son. I am also an active member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm a professor at BYU where I teach courses in literacy education, educational research methods, and multicultural education. I was raised in a biracial home and converted to the LDS faith when I was 19. I think it's important to understand that I was neither raised Mormon nor homophobic. I think that's an important point to bring up. It is also important to understand that my queer son was not born to me, but rather sought out our home after coming out, needing a safe place to live and be loved. My goals today is to disrupt the notion of boundary maintenance, given who I am as an LDS woman, a mother of a queer son. I would like to suggest instead queering the boundaries that we make and maintain. Allow me to begin by sharing some of the challenges faced by moms of LGBTQ individuals. And I assume this is the case for other folks who seek to support LGBTQ individuals within the LDS faith. When my son came out to me, he was not out to the world. I promised him that the only person I would tell was my husband, and I left it up to him to tell my other sons and the rest of the world. Therefore, while I was completely supportive of my son, I felt isolated by his coming out. Where could I turn for help without compromising his confidence? Who could help me process this information in a way that would respect my love of the gospel, my goals as a mother, and my love for my son? What were other mothers doing to help their children in the context of their LDS faith? How could I maintain my faith and confidence in the church given the reality of my son's life, which at the time of his coming out included severe depression, anxiety accompanied by suicide ideation? I cannot find answers immediately within my faith community, as discussions of LGBTQ lives seem forbidden within church settings. I hit a boundary. I also did not know where to meet LDS LGBTQ individuals, a community that I assumed existed, but I didn't know how to access, or even if it was proper for me to do so. I didn't know anything about the boundaries of that community. Thus, I initially looked for online resources and found very little that seemed to speak to me as a mother. I buried myself in the literature around LGBTQ issues, depression, and helping a loved one with suicide ideation, and what the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints taught about being gay and Mormon. As an academic, I took profound interest in queer theory, and as an educator, gravitated toward queer pedagogy. I worked within my own boundaries as a person with access to the internet, as an LDS woman, and as an academic. I found some answers. I also found ways to insert myself into the LDS LGBTQ community and conversation. I have also participated to some degree within the larger LGBTQ conversation as an academic, and thus I find myself testing boundaries of various communities, relying on the goodwill of others to accept me as a member of those communities. In August of last year, I wrote in my personal journal, I recognize at once that I am not queer. And when I am in the queer community, I am wholly aware that I am an interloper and a guest. I recognize also that my views on LGBTQ matters mark me as someone to be feared or at least handled with care among some members of the ward or even my colleagues at the university, communities to which I have belonged without fear in the past. And so I move within those communities with a degree of caution in order to protect my own soul. I feel my place in both communities is tenuous and conditional, and that is a bit hard on my heart. I have considered getting out of this fight. This is not my fight, I say to myself as justification to walk away to the comforts of my community and to my established scholarship and to my settled soul. This fight came to you is a thing I am reminded of as I stay. I realize there is no comfort in my community until this fight is won. I realize that I can use my scholarship in this fight. I realize that this is my soul work. And so I find myself somewhat uncomfortable occupying this space between peace and complete disarray, between faith and utter disbelief, between hope and crushing despair, between my desire to fight and my desire to surrender in defeat. I have found queer theory useful in helping me make sense of these binaries and boundaries and the points in between. Challenging my own identity, for instance, as an insider or outsider, has been a disruptive project. Queer theory invites me to ask questions of identity and how normal is produced and reproduced within communities. Moreover, rather than focusing on identities in need of repair or identities as the problem, queer theory shifts my focus of inquiry toward larger society's need to define, produce, and protect normal by rejecting anything that appears to be deviant. For me, as a straight cisgender person, queer theory offers a way to consider my shifting identity as an LDS woman away from a more mainstream point within Mormonism, an identity that I would have rejected even prior to my son's arrival in my family, and toward an identity as an LDS woman who finds herself outside of what would be considered mainstream. Queer theory allows me to move away from viewing queer identities, including my own emerging queer identity, as problematic. And I realize the trouble with identifying myself as queer, but in this context, the identity has proven helpful. And I refer you to Schlichter's work on that notion. Rather, queer theory allows me to examine the problems in the various communities I occupy and that have located queer bodies, queer desires, and queer lives as other or outside of the boundary that encompasses normal. As such, my own sense of normalization itself has become the subject of my analysis, and I have begun to see my inclusion and exclusion from various communities as a problem of culture and of thought. This allows me the freedom to see myself not as a person who is broken or in need of some special treatment. Indeed, I needn't be pitied or celebrated or perhaps even understood, but as a person who is part of a larger community of humans who have unquestioningly accepted normal, and conversely as a person who has also rejected people who might find themselves outside the confines of normal. Indeed, I can't help but understand my own complicity in nominalizing those around me by creating a community that both produces and rejects some individuals. Like all of us, I am a boundary maker and maintainer. All the while, I understand that, as I've pointed out before, taking up a straight cisgender identity as part of a queer community also challenges the limits and boundaries of queerness, something that I cannot do on my own. Indeed, to take up a non-mainstream LDS position, a position that isn't unique for mothers of LGBTQ kids within the LDS community, or to take up a straight cisgender position within a queer community does not simply necessitate my own desire to do so. It also requires the permission of the community to expand its borders to include someone like me. Thus, I must work both as an individual and as a member of the community to offer an alternative to normal and to create a community in which my particular variety of normal is included. Intellectually, I knew that I could not be the only LDS mother of a queer kid. Just running the numbers would make that clear. But finding those mothers proved very difficult. About a year after my son came out, I found the Mama Dragons group, which had about 20 members at that time. The group has grown to over 800 members. Last year, I interviewed 45 of them as part of a project that I'm conducting. I was interested in their stories, both out of curiosity and out of my own desire to know if my journey as an LDS mother of another woman's child was normal. So such a selfish thing to do, to undertake a research project to find out if you're okay. But I'm a full professor, so that's what I do. What I found were stories of mothers who were both fierce and humble, loving and angered, determined and scared, and faithful and doubtful. I could relate so well to the paradoxes that they held comfortably, albeit loosely. They told stories of shifting their gospel focus away from the doctrine of strict obedience and toward an understanding of agency from an eternal perspective. They told stories of caring less about eternal consequences and who might accompany them to the celestial kingdom, and caring more about the current temporal and spiritual needs of their LGBTQ children. They told stories of how they worried less about following the word of prophets with exactness and instead took comfort in the working of the Spirit within themselves that stirred them to action for both their own children and for other people's children. Their stories filled me with hope and courage as a mother, as a member of the LDS community, and as a worker to make the world a better place. With the Mama Dragons, I have found community. With them, I experience a sense of belonging. With them, I am completely normal. With them, I needn't exist on some boundary at the risk of being rejected or expelled. My feelings are valued, my goals are valued, the ways in which I work to keep my family safe and whole are valued, and the ways I affirm my son and his life are valued. I am safe to feel joy for his relationship with his boyfriend. I am safe to feel angry with a new policy. I am safe to help a new mama accept a new name for her trans kid. I am safe to share ideas for how to make the world safer and more welcoming for LGBTQ individuals. With that said, the Mama Dragons is not completely an inclusive group. Men, for instance, are not welcome to join. There is another group for them. It's not as awesome, but whatever. That's not in my script. I also know that not all LDS mothers of LGBTQ kids have felt safe with the Mama Dragons. Members of the group can be crass, and their anger toward the church often comes out in biting commentary. And so some women leave. The Mama Dragons certainly create and maintain their own boundaries. Meanwhile, the Mama Dragons community exists on the boundaries of the LDS community and is often viewed with suspicion and fear. Similarly, the Mama Dragons exist on the boundaries of the LDS LGBTQ community and again is often viewed with suspicion and fear. But the community exists and is a place of refuge for many mothers who suddenly find themselves on a path that they had not prepared for themselves. For many LDS mothers who find themselves working to make sense of what they could not bear to know about their child, about their relationships, about their church, the Mama Dragons represents a community whose boundaries are just right. I suppose the point I would like to make is that individuals take up difficult work as boundary makers, maintainers, and crossers, something that I am somewhat comfortable with as a biracial female academic, LDS convert, working mother. I have found myself crossing many borders many times. Thus, each of us must do careful work to understand our own efforts as makers of boundaries. This is what we are all engaged in. How do we make the boundaries that we do? How do those boundaries serve to protect us? How do those boundaries harm us or cut us off from people who would contribute to our own well-being? We must examine our work in maintaining boundaries. Why do we feel threatened when our boundaries are challenged? How much effort do we put into protecting the boundaries that we have created? Are those efforts worth it when we consider the consequences? And we must take up the work of queering boundaries. What might we gain by stretching our boundaries? What does the community stand to gain by including those outside of the boundary? What are our limits with regards to inclusivity? Ultimately, communities must take up the important work of questioning the boundaries they make, the efforts they place in protecting and maintaining those boundaries, and how those boundaries serve to exclude goodness and stunt the growth of the community. This work begins with imagination, and that is a topic for another day. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I joined the church at a very young age and grew up attending without my family, who were by and large not religious. One of my earliest memories is me walking home from school one day with Ricky, my next door neighbor and playmate. And we were just coming up on the gate that separated the schoolyard from the gravel road that I lived on. And we were talking about what we wanted to be when we grew up. And I don't remember what he said. His dad was a border patrolman, so I assume it was something like police officer or FBI agent. And when my turn came, I said, with conviction, I want to be a wife. And his eyes got really, really big. And I realized that I had crossed a line. I was a quick-witted 8-year-old, and so I brushed it off as a joke, haha, and spent the next few minutes talking earnestly about how I really wanted to be an architect. Of course, I didn't really want to be a wife. I was 8 years old, and in my mind, if all I really wanted from the future was a husband, then I must want to be a wife. I never crossed that line again. Instead, I buried what had blossomed on that bright spring morning, but of course, buried things don't stay buried for long, especially beautiful things like love. Still, it wasn't until 15 years later that I once again dared to utter something so very close to my heart. It was 3 a.m. on a Sunday morning, and I was up late with a neighbor talking about what we wanted to be when we grew up. I sense a pattern here. And out of the blue, he asked me the question I hadn't dared ask myself. Harry, he said, are you gay? And I stuttered and mumbled something along the lines of, yes, wow, look at the time. I got up and I headed home. I had church in the morning. Today I'm an out gay man and an active member of my ward. I serve in the elders quorum presidency. I organize our annual chili cook-off, and I'm the priesthood chorister. In my Mormon.org profile, I say, as a gay man who understands that my orientation is a gift and not a curse, I've often been asked how it is that I could possibly be part of a church that so thoroughly misunderstands who I am and my value in the eyes of my Father in heaven. It's hard, I say. I pray for change, but I also pray for patience. I was born gay, and I chose to be Mormon. And being Mormon is a choice I make every day. It's not always an easy choice, but it's mine. The church is a work in progress, just like me." End quote. I am, you might say, intimately familiar with the myriad boundaries imposed upon queer members of the church. I am, I must confide, painfully aware of the costs. This is the final session of a 3-day conference on boundary making and keeping as it pertains to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm sure you've heard plenty of boundary metaphors, walls, fences, lines in the sand. So I'll skip the beautiful one I crafted using Mississippi River levees and instead just jump to the payoff. Boundaries are morally neutral. They keep things in, they keep things out. Sometimes they keep the right things in and the right things out, and sometimes they don't. And almost always there are unintended consequences. Talking about these consequences is important. It helps us to evaluate and improve the boundary. Responsible gatekeepers and wall builders take stock of the boundaries that they maintain. Responsible gatekeepers and wall builders take note of the problems they cause. On the afternoon of Thursday, November 5th at 2:59, John DeLynn of Mormon Stories fame posted something on Facebook. Quote, "I'm hearing incredible rumor of a new definition of LDS apostasy that now specifically includes same-gender marriage as grounds for apostasy." End quote. 14 minutes later, he confirmed the rumor with a screenshot of the change, and in short order, additional details were added. Poignantly, that children of such couples were to be denied baptisms and other blessings of membership. What followed was a storm of epic proportions. For the first few hours, I watched as defenders of the faith argued vigorously that this was a stunt or a hoax by John DeLynn to defame the church. The church, they argued, would never do such a thing. But as more details came out and as news outlets got around to the business of fact-checking the story, their song changed. And suddenly the church, which couldn't possibly do such a thing, was on God's errand. It was a sight to behold. The texts, messages, and phone calls began to stream in and didn't stop for a solid week. I and so many of my brothers and sisters in Christ were in shock, and we were seeking each other out. Did you hear? Are you okay? The next morning, I posted something to my Facebook wall that was picked up by my friends at By Common Consent, a Mormon group blog. Quote, "As I lay here this morning, awash in a flood of emotion, shock, dismay, disappointment, and fear, I am coming to the idea that last night's policy announcement was a profound betrayal. Not the hot betrayal of animus, but the cold betrayal of studied indifference. Yes, it feels like animus. It looks like animus. But it smells like the well-oiled machinery of an inhuman bureaucracy, grinding away. And this morning, I am mustering what strength I have to whisper to myself, the worm forgives the plow. The worm forgives the plow. To my friends who have left and to my friends who are now leaving, I understand being a part of the kingdom of God isn't supposed to hurt this much. You'll be sorely missed. Perhaps not by the shepherds who should know better, but by me at least, and by others who notice when virtue goes out of them. I've said elsewhere that being a Mormon is a choice I make every day. Today is a hard day to choose, but today I choose to stay. The church is traveling through new territory, and the roads out here can be brutal. Last night, our wagon lost a wheel. Yet I have hope. The promised land is out there, a land where the full spectrum of godly love is embraced, where families of all stripes are nurtured by the good word of God as they go about magnifying their holy calling. To borrow a phrase from our cousins in faith, next year in Jerusalem. End quote. My heart had been cut out, and this was the best I could do. The policy of exclusion, POX, was real. The church's public relation apparatus creaked into action and did what it could to manage the story, including a half-hearted attempt to describe the policy of exclusion as a blessing for the children involved. I'll set aside the question of whether or not the policy of exclusion was in any way inspired. I'll set aside the real consequences for the families targeted by the policy. I will instead, ever so briefly, discuss the fallout from this clumsy act of boundary keeping. 1, there have been and will continue to be suicides as a direct result of the policy of exclusion and the climate it fosters. The numbers are hard to come by for obvious reasons, but there are already confirmed deaths. 2, professional and armchair apologists are already distorting core doctrines of the church to make space for this heretofore unimaginable act of cruelty. It began with frightening speed just a couple hours after John DeLynne's post and continues to this day. Baptism, the line goes, can wait. The gift of the Holy Ghost isn't quite as essential for children as we once thought. What's worse, perhaps, if the policy robbing black saints of the blessings of the priesthood is any indication at all, the harm done by this post hoc theories justifying the unjustifiable will actually outlive the policy by decades. Zombie doctrines, unwilling to die, perpetuated by a church unwilling to apologize. 3, this hastily written policy will continue to be a source of operational confusion unless and until the church rescinds or rewrites the policy. As anyone who's ever been in a bishopric knows, letters of clarification fade quickly from memory, stuffed into the back of the battered old binder that holds the handbooks of instruction. If it's not printed in the handbook, mentioned in the table of contents, and listed in the index, it's lost to the ages. 4, the policy is already driving away the tender-hearted among us. In the hours and days after the leak, I was sought out by countless friends and acquaintances who needed someone to talk to, someone understanding, someone safe. I spoke to ward and stake leaders from my area, to children of general authorities, to faithful Latter-day Saints of every stripe, each and every one in utter dismay. Some had asked to be released from callings, others turned down callings that had just been extended. One friend, the son of a member of the 70, was a candidate for stake president and found himself praying for the call not to come. Then, on Sunday, December 13th, at stake conference, my stake president held up a stack of white papers and commented that since November 5th, 110 stake members had resigned. And for every one person I know who resigned, I know 10 who are on life support. On February 23rd of this year, Elder Bednar of the 12 attended a regional meeting in Chile, where he participated in Q&A of sorts, where one question in particular caught the world's attention. How, he was asked, can homosexual members of the church live and remain steadfast in the gospel? Elder Bednar's response was somewhat lengthy, but led with this comment. First, he said, I want to change the question. There are no homosexual members of the church. Elder Bednar continued, we are not defined by sexual attraction. We are not defined by sexual behavior. We are sons and daughters of God, and all of us have different challenges in the flesh. The rest of his response builds upon this premise, and if you have a chance, I recommend reading his response in its entirety. But as you consider his response, it's important to know that Elder Bednar has answered similar questions in other settings in much the same way. This wasn't off the cuff. I don't know his intent in building this wall, where and how he did. But here's the bottom line. In those few minutes, Elder Bednar effectively erased the lived experience of hundreds of thousands of members of the church, a rhetorical sleight of hand that will only ever be used against queer members of the church because other scenarios are preposterous. Who, after all, would think to say that there are no blacks in the church, that there are no single people or women? Who indeed? So there's exclusion, and there's erasure. And then there's this curious tug of war that we have regarding the scope and shape of hope. It's a tug of war with a couple fronts. It's 1980. You're a 17-year-old man who is attracted to other men your age. You've never acted on it. You've read Spencer W. Kimball's Miracle of Forgiveness. You've read Elder Packer's Talk to the One, and you've heard the snide remarks by the adults in your life, and it is perfectly clear. Homosexuality is a sin next to murder. And you've heard the comments about tying a millstone around a sinner's neck as an act of blood atonement. And you've thought many times about ending it all. But against your better judgment, you decide to talk to your bishop. He's a great guy, a spiritual giant, who has been with you at every important intersection of your life. You want some guidance, some reason to live. Unbeknownst to you, a kid in the next stake over was just excommunicated for having just this conversation with his bishop. But you luck out. Your bishop sits you down, and then he sits down behind his large desk, putting as much room as politely possible between himself and you. And he tells you this. He promises that if you complete an honorable mission and then return and marry a good girl, all will be forgiven. He reminds you that with God, all things are possible if you have faith. It's 2016. You're a 17-year-old young man who is attracted to other men your age. You've never acted upon it. A few of your friends at school are out of the closet, and you're wondering whether you should come out yourself and what your future might look like. On one hand, you visited MormonandGays.org, read every page and watched every interview. You've heard Elder Uchtdorf's multiple calls for a large and inclusive approach to building the kingdom of God. You've heard about the Gay-Straight Alliance at BYU. And you know the church was active in passing statutes in Utah that protected LGBT persons from discrimination in housing and employment. And then, on the other hand, you remember President Packer's talks and Elder Oaks and President Nelson's. And you've watched the church as it called for the children of gay couples to be denied the blessings that you, a gay kid, have so richly cherished. And then you cringed as you watched Elder Bednar declare that there were no homosexuals in church. You know that this is something about you that will never change. Not in this life, at least. So in the first scenario, we have a soul-damning condemnation of our very being, coupled with a glib promise that you'll be cured so long as you toe the line and have faith, a festering heap of hurt iced over with the empty promises of false hope. And in the second scenario, you have a brief glimpses of radiant hope, occulted by constant and damning reminders of your place as a second-class citizen in the kingdom of God. Sure, you're welcome. But in the last 3 decades, the church has abandoned the carrot, but somehow managed to keep the stick. Today, queer members like me who remain, and queer children who have no choice in the matter, are perpetual strangers in our own wards and homes, encouraged or commanded to stay, but otherwise told to bury our brightest emotions and to sit out life's greatest moments. The walls of our faith, shutting us into well-furnished and cozy oubliettes. That's a haunting word, oubliette. It's French for the forgotten place. And these small dungeons were meant as places to secret away troublesome enemies of the state. But look, mine has a cozy chair, it has a small library, and a large but sturdy windows. Outside, children play, as if cheered on by the upbeat chords of Eliza R. Snow's In Our Lovely Deseret, which proclaims, In our lovely deseret, where the saints of God have met, there's a multitude of children all around. They are generous and brave. They have precious souls to save. They must listen and obey the gospel sound. But through the thick glass, the music slows and strikes a minor key, and new lyrics speak to the irony of a church that celebrates children and reveres the family, but willingly sacrifices so many of its children and families on the fires of Molech. But I refuse to be forgotten, so I refuse to be silent. I work for that day that the writer of Proverbs envisioned, where he said, Hope deferred maketh the heart sick, but when the desire cometh, it is a tree of life. A tree which Nephi described as bearing the fruit of God's eternal love. Thank you.
So, any questions?
So before we answer questions, just a real quick preamble. I'm very passionate about where I am in the world, and I'm fairly bold in my assertions. But I want to couch my comments in this truth. I'm a white, cisgender, gay man. And while I hope that my experience is illustrative, it certainly isn't, universal. Lesbians, bisexual persons, trans, other queer people will have other experiences. People of color will have, again, another set of experiences. So I just think that's important to say. Well, not just important, it's critical. And in that same vein, as I talk about the policy of exclusion, I don't want to ever forget the fact that it was modeled on the secret policy of exclusion of the innocent children of polygamous families, and they're victims too. So, anyway, questions?
Oh, and the third one, wait for the mic.
So this is for both of you. When this policy came out, of course, we're all familiar with all the backlash, and I know people who left the church or at least quit attending, even children of general authorities. So my question is, what ties each of you? What is the one thing that really ties you to that group, to the church still? What is the thing that gives you that hope or that reason for staying that's unique about the LDS tradition, despite this struggle, obviously, that you're facing under the current circumstances?
Well, I guess part of it, and I think it's sort of maybe hidden in the words that I shared, but I'm hoping that the church becomes much more inclusive, and I don't think it can do that without people staying and making that happen. I think that we look at the church and we want change to come, and we look at it top down, but I think that it happens bottom up. And if all the people who get perturbed leave, then there's nobody to sort of really push at those boundaries. And so the basic things about loving the gospel, about really feeling compelled by the message of Christ, those continue to compel me. And I think that in church and in worship provides an opportunity for people to become better. That's at least the purported goal. And so for me, it feels like a comfortable place to do that work.
And along those lines, I think I would add, before getting into specifics for myself, is that, the children born into this church, I mean, just to make it clear, you don't choose to be gay. You're born that way. And Mormons are really good at making children. So the fact of the matter is that 1 in 20 children in the church are LGBT, and they don't have a choice. So I think that there is, however else you manage your own mental health, your own spiritual health, you can't make a decision without understanding that if you do leave, you're abandoning the ones left behind. As for myself, I have an entire life of rich and, frankly, undeniable spiritual experiences. For lack of a better term, I know this is an academic setting, but I have a testimony. But beyond that, Mormonism is my faith language. Mormonism is my best friend. We talked about God growing up, and that's what I know. It's the social technology I'm familiar with. So for all those reasons, it's very complex. But I don't regret staying, and I've joked before, although it's really not joking. I'll stay until there's a court order. Go ahead, Miss. Sorry.
Short of a revelation which would allow same-sex marriage within the church, what changes do you think could be made to have more inclusion, more love, and not have the language of curse, of challenges, that this is a problem, a sin that needs to be fixed?
Well, I think first we have to acknowledge that gay children, bisexual children, transgender children are going to be born in the church. Like, if we just acknowledge that from the get-go, if when a child is born, we could look honestly and say, I don't know, there's a good chance this is a heterosexual child, but maybe not. Like, if we were like that honest and we were thinking about that, I think that'd make a huge difference. I think, but you'd see where there'd have to be changes in primary curriculum, in young men, young women curriculum that would include sort of ideas that maybe not everyone's going to get married. Maybe not everybody even desires to marry, or their desires to marry look very different, and that we could acknowledge that and we could even talk about that. That wouldn't have to be a forbidden conversation.
Yeah, and that actually, just that part was, if you watched General Conference, just 2 weeks ago. Yeah, 2 weeks ago. I watched a couple sessions. There was, a talk about that. Although now I can't remember who it was, who said, when we're singing about our eternal family, some children in there won't be singing about their own family.
Anderson, yeah.
Yeah, it was Anderson. It was wonderful, and if I were better with names, I would have pulled that out. But so that's one part. Another thing to remember is in the church, especially in progressive quarters, we often talk about bishop roulette, and it's always roulette is not a word you use about something that you like. But I wouldn't use bishop roulette, because let me be perfectly clear here and perfectly candid. The advances that we make in the church happen at the front lines, and if every ward were the same, we would not be a straight line across at the progressive edge of Mormon understanding. It would be back a few miles, and so I'm thankful for surprises. I can't think of a word for roulette. Anyways, I'm thankful for those differences. And in the wards that I know, and many of the wards that I love and attend and I have friends in, they're conveniently not paying much attention to that policy. And as long as we have well-adjusted gay couples in the wards and well-adjusted gay children and in primary, and the children of well-adjusted gay couples in primary singing up on the stand and leaving on missions, this policy and others like it have no chance of surviving over the long haul, because understanding casteth out fear.
Visibility, maybe too.
Yeah.
Well, I think it makes a difference to have people out, right? I think that all of us are going to church with people who are gay, but that we don't know it is part of the challenge. But the church is a scary place to be out, and so it's tricky. It's a tricky place to be out as a mom of a gay kid. I can't, that's and if you're out as a mom of a gay kid, but you're like sad that your kid is gay, then that you could be out that way. But if you're out and really happy for your kid and happy for his future and what he's doing, then that is much more problematic. And so we're missing visibility on all ends. We're missing the visibility of queer individuals, and we're missing the visibility of people who love them. And I think that can make it very difficult.
And one last thing, my ward is a good ward, right? But they're not exactly the hallmark of progressivism. The reason why I am given the space to exist in my ward, in that safe place, is because my ward is an inner city ward that is occupied day and night with service. They've got other things to do, and if your ward was more occupied with service, maybe it would be a little bit more inclusive as well. So, next question. Now you.
So, I was actually going to ask a very similar question, so I'm trying to think of how I can add upon it. But especially with things like not the For Strength of Youth, the proclamation on the family and things like that, church doctrine, as it currently stands, seems to point completely away from this possibility of gay couples being accepted in the church. Do you have any kind of insights, personal, in your scripture study or anything like that, that can kind of support a way you could see a path to doctrinal understanding that would allow for that?
So I'm in my Elders Quorum presidency. I teach Elders Quorum, and I made sure that I taught the lesson on the proclamation. And just so you understand, I'm kind of a fan. That's a different topic for discussion, but I'm kind of a fan. And here's why I'm at least in part a fan. You know, we don't have a lot of materials surrounding, you know, how the Bible was created. I mean, there's scholarship that goes a long way, but you know, sometimes we just have to take the Bible at face value. And I know academics would have a problem with that, but when I read, you know, the Bible, I kind of take it at face value, and I think that if we take the proclamation at face value, one of the most obvious things is it doesn't mention gays. I don't know if the lawyers that drafted it were just afraid to say sex and say gay, but they didn't say either. They said powers of procreation, and they completely skipped the issue of homosexuality. And so when I talk about the proclamation of the family, I talk about, you know, the parts that are actually there. People say, oh, I know, but it's about gays. I'm like, well, this is a postmodern world. Look at the text. It's not in the text. I'm sorry, we're moving on.
Yeah, I'm just like one person, and I don't know how that is all going to work. I don't know. I just think that I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about the marriage piece. I have thought a lot about the Family Proclamation. I think about the Family Proclamation as a personal text for me and not a text to use to beat up my child. And so that's been very useful for me to put in my head. I don't know about things like the doctrine, you know, the talk about once people die, and they're resurrected, that their sexuality is completely different. I think that is an interesting notion, and I wonder, as a heterosexual person, if I'm willing to consider that once I die and resurrected, that my sexuality would be changed. Like I imagine that. Like, what if everybody's sexuality changes? And nobody gets the sexuality that they're in right now. Like, if it's possible for the gay people, like, it's got to be possible for the hetero people as well. And so I think about, well, what would that mean? What would that look like? Would I like that? Would I not like that? You know, I don't know. But I think, again, you know, that we ought to imagine that whatever we're saying for somebody, that, like, how would that, what was just said, how would that apply to me? And how would I feel about that, or how would I think about that? You know, and as I talk to my son, and he says, I don't even know, who would I be if I wasn't queer? I don't know. I don't even know if I'd like you. So I don't know. I have a lot of questions like you do, and I'm like a faithful person, letting some of the questions sort of go by the way and thinking more about, so how do I treat people? How do I get myself straight? Straight, that's funny. How do I keep myself on some path of progression? Those sorts of things.
Some have theorized that this policy came about as a result of a Supreme Court decision. It sounds plausible to me. You can see the ramification. If a country recognizes a gay marriage, then church might have to deal with that some future time. Is that the best theory of conjecture we have, or is there some other insight you might have on this?
Well, I think that's an interesting theory. I don't know. I think that, given the church as a global church and the fact that same-sex marriage exists in other countries and has for a very long time, Canada is a good example, and there wasn't sort of the need to have this same kind of pushback, I think is really interesting. But then in that case, then I wonder about the ethnocentricity of LDS Church that proclaims to be worldwide, but then maybe sort of still works as very American, and that can be equally disturbing for us to think about.
The theory is really troubling, and on those points. The fact is that homosexuals have been getting married worldwide for some time. We're kind of a little late to the game. So if the Mormon Church is really God's church on earth, but they only react to Utah politics, then there's something profoundly amiss.
On the other hand, I think that's part of this whole boundary kind of notion, right? So that that we recognize same-sex marriage. This is the idea of homosexuality, transgender kinds of matters are less taboo for young people, and so we see a cultural shift, right? And so that it makes sense then culturally to sort of push back on that boundary and try to put that boundary in some sort of location that feels comfortable and that feels like how we understand our culture. And so I think that if we look at this from a boundary situation, then it would make sense that we're going to push up against it, or there's going to be pushback, then people are going to have to push back, and that would be sort of how life goes. But I don't know that makes us happier to know that's how cultures work. But what we have to understand, again, is that we're part of that. It's easy to say the church, the leaders, those up there, those other guys that don't get it, they're in some other place. But we are part of that conversation too, regardless of whether we're LDS or not, because we're part of this American culture, this human culture that continues to create boundaries and continues to say, yeah, you're good enough to be in this boundary and you are really odd and deviant, and so you need to be elsewhere. We're part of that as well, and we need to do the work of reflecting on how we're part of that.
Any other questions?
So I guess kind of a short two-parter. I have a really dear friend of mine who is homosexual, and for the last 8 years was not active, was not part of the church, had stepped away from that in an attempt to kind of explore that side of himself. And after that, he found something missing, and he felt like that was the gospel and that's what he needed to bring back in his life. And what he's found in terms of this boundary conversation, what he's found has been really interesting for me as a heterosexual to watch go down as he has tried to come back to the church, is in a way he's kind of been excommunicated from the gay community. He talks about how he has felt more rejection from them since trying to come back than he ever felt from the church in going away. So one part is there kind of within these boundaries, I understand there's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of frustration on that side of things. Is there a point though where within that community there's a conversation going on that says we do need to allow people to explore the fluidity of that boundary? And then, sorry, quick part two, as part of that is, what I've noticed is that for him, he's also kind of experienced a sense of guilt, where he talks about how, am I less gay than some of the other people? Because he's like, I view it as a part of myself, but it's not my identity. And so where does this line get drawn where it's your identity and it's offensive if you reject your identity within the community?
Boundary making and keeping goes all directions. And the fact of the matter is that I've been called an Uncle Tom, for remaining in the church. How dare you lend your moral and material and social support for an organization that does X, Y, or Z? And that's something that really moves me. How do you? But the fact of the matter is I can't think of an organization on the planet that doesn't have an X, Y, or Z. And I'm not checking out, and I refuse to check out. So I check in and I participate. And I think that that's something that everybody's going to have to come to their own. I have friends along the same lines. And I think that there are mentally healthy ways of doing that and mentally unhealthy ways of doing that. And that's about the extent of my comment on that.
And I think that within the LGBTQ community, it makes sense to be really worried about people who are going back into a church that they feel could really do them harm. And so they're coming from a place of love also, right? And I think that we have to really embrace that and think about why that would be. I think that we also, if we're really thinking about authenticity, and we talk, we hear often in the LGBTQ community about folks living an authentic life and being authentic to themselves. For many folks, I think Christian's a great example, being authentic means being a member of the church. And so that we have to honor that path as well, that if I'm going to be affirming to people, that I'm going to affirm their religious path as well and try to support them and do that in a healthy way. The same way that I do when I affirm people who are in mixed orientation marriages and they are working to make that work, I could sit them down and say, this is never going to work. This is so silly. Why are you doing this? This is mean. This is cruel. Quit it. But that's not really helpful, and that's not very affirming to the decisions that they've made, the promises that they want to keep. And so my place has to be a place of affirming and listening and trying to be supportive, regardless of the path that people are taking, especially when that path does have the potential to be a healthy path. I mean, obviously, if someone's doing something that is clearly harmful, I need to help them take a detour. But other than that, I need to be supportive, and that is for me, that's part of my religious practice to figure out how to do that. Oh, go ahead.
We've actually got one. Do we have time for one more?
You're the boss, Boyd.
Hello. Okay. So you both mentioned the church's doctrine that in the afterlife, people are all going to be heterosexual, essentially.
Well, no, they just say that you're not going to be gay. I don't know that maybe we're going to be asexual. See, I'm thinking of all kinds of scenarios.
Yeah, and I don't know that. For example, I don't know that that's the case. I mean, the Proclamation on the Family says that gender is an eternal aspect of who we are, and my gender is a male who really digs other males. So.
Okay,
there is. I mean, if you investigate Mormons and gays.org, you'll find that kind of phrasing.
Yeah.
Well, there have been statements by general authorities of all different levels about that stating exactly that, including in Bednar's comments. He kind of goes on to elaborate on that kind of principle. Do you think that the idea that there are essentially no gays in the afterlife is different than the idea that there are no gays in the church? And if so, why?
I think the idea is different, but then again, I think that what we haven't heard, and again, I'm a reader, is we haven't heard that everyone's going to be heterosexual. And so then I say, well, perhaps everyone's going to be asexual. Well, that's maybe just as frustrating a thought as anything else. And how comfortable are we with that? And why would we be uncomfortable with that? So I think that I think what it lends itself to is a vast impossibility of really knowing what the afterlife is going to be, and like us little-brained humans trying to figure that out in our little heteronormative ways. This is part of, I think, of what happens.
And, to borrow a phrase from Paul, which is not what I'm normally doing, it's through a glass darkly, the afterlife. But I want to answer the question directly. There is a difference. And, when I was 8 years old, I could not imagine a world where I didn't live with my mother, where I didn't play with Legos, and I am now mumble years old, and I don't live with my mother, and I don't play with Legos. And so the fact that we can't imagine something being a reality as being some sort of proof that that's not going to be the reality, it doesn't work for me. So maybe that is. But the real difference is this. When I say that there are no homosexuals in the church, that erases my lived experience. When I say there are no homosexuals in the eternities, it's not my lived experience. It's my resurrected, something beyond the veil experience, and it doesn't matter to me as much. But I will also say this: I don't think it's a doctrinally sound statement. We believe that the same sociality which possesses us today will possess us on the other side of the veil. And let me tell you, men are part of my sociality.
So, are you saying that gays cannot play with Legos?
Or live with their mothers?
Just
No comment.
wow, jeez. So I have a good friend. He's gay, and he feels very unhappy about the policy that's just come out. As far as I'm concerned, all LGBT, all gay, queer, pansexual, whatever you may, should not be cast out of the congregation, should not be felt like they're left out. But my question to you is, what kind of solution are you looking for to this problem? Is it the inclusiveness of, I don't know if that's the right word, but to include those who are LGBT, pansexual, or is it to change the doctrine aspect, like to include gay marriage, to allow them to perform in ordinances that they have not previously been allowed to? That is my question for you.
You'll notice by my position and my gender that I'm never going to be in charge of proclaiming doctrine.
Thank God for small mirrors.
I know, see, because everyone would have to wear this dress. I mean, it'd be very hard. And so I don't spend, and this likely is a privilege of my straightness and my marriage and my family. I don't spend any time worrying about doctrine. I spend a lot of time worrying about the humans who are feeling excluded. Doctrine does not have to change for us to be nice. Doctrine doesn't have to change for children to be raised and not loathe their own existence. No doctrine has to be changed for that. And for us to sit around waiting for doctrine to change while people are feeling terrible and they're dying and they're miserable is to, again, to point fingers at the general authorities and to take us off the hook to really do something that is powerful and profound and loving within our neighborhoods and our own congregations.
Yeah, the real approach is pastoral, right? The fact of the matter is that I don't know what your ward's like, but my ward hasn't stoned a divorcee in years. Divorcees
Bishop
are,
Roulette.
Yeah. Divorcees are active members of the ward, and even though the scriptures are pretty clear on what should happen to divorced people, we haven't done that. So, we've held back. And instead, we're busy, working in the kingdom. I was dating this wonderful man who was Baptist, and it didn't work out. And it's not because he was Baptist. But I'm like, how does it work in your ward? He's like, wait, Christian, we're all sinners. We don't focus on, what your flavor of sin is, which sounds vaguely familiar, right? I think Elder Uchtdorf had something to say about that. We don't focus on what flavor your sin is. We focus on feeding God's sheep and teaching correct principles and letting them govern themselves and things like that. And I think that's the way we approach it. Because, I don't say doctrine not because of her reasons. I don't say doctrine because you can't tell me what doctrine is. I mean, the church's teachings. And I'll tell you what, if we have gay people in the wards being active members of the wards, showing up and helping people move and taking down chairs after, priesthood meeting, if we have gay people actively in the wards, the teaching will change. Because God is love, and we don't have to go much farther than that.
So I hesitate to stop this conversation, but let me help us facilitate prolonging it. We're hosting I don't know what the correct word would be. We could call
closing
it a reception,
social.
But closing social. We're hosting a closing social at the Alumni House, which is just up the street here on campus, just off of Campus Drive. If you need information on how to get there, just see me or Brian. And we can help you find the place, but you're all welcome to come. Hopefully most, if not all of our speakers will be there, and you can ask them some questions there in a more informal way, and we'll have snacks, right? So please join me in thanking Christian and Ronnie Joe.